BierTalk. Gespräche über und beim Bier. Hello and welcome to another episode of our podcast, BierTalk. Today we make a very interesting journey. We go in the northern part of Europe, visit a beer writer, a beer author who maybe discovered a whole new range of beer or beer ideas, whatever. We meet Lars Garshol, and he wrote some books about beer, and it's nice to have you here, and maybe you introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners.
Yeah, hi. My name is Lars Marius Garshol. I used to be just an ordinary beer enthusiast, but got very, very interested in traditional farmhouse ale and have spent the last decade or so working on that.
Yeah, and you had a huge impact on the whole beer scene, what is very interesting and what really brought very interesting findings. We will talk about that. And we last met in Prague at the Brewers Forum. We had an interesting talk with other beer judges or beer people about, in general, what is the idea of beer and beer styles and all of this. But maybe we go a little bit back in history. So you started blogging about beer in 2005, and interestingly, you started with a journey through Franconia, which is my country, and so you discovered our beer culture. So maybe first question, what are your impressions, and have you ever been to Bamberg?
I was in Bamberg on that trip, and this was really when I was first getting started as a beer enthusiast. So I was not super knowledgeable, and I was still learning the art of really tasting a beer and all of this. So I found it very interesting. I liked the German lagers very much. But it seemed to me that the Franconian beer scene was not doing well. I saw a lot of closed breweries back then.
Yeah, it was maybe the end of a time where we had some closures, but around this time, so 2005 to 2010, the tide was turning. So now we even had an increase in breweries in Franconia until COVID, of course. Now it's a little bit unsure at the moment how it will continue. But yes, there was a time of let's say, a little bit decay, just because I think many of these family-run breweries, the children did something else, so have no really interest in continue the brewing, and so some of them had to close. But now I would say brewing or becoming a brewer is again a little bit more sexy. So brewers like to become brewers, or children of brewers like to become brewers again, and we see that in many examples which we have here also around the area. So, but could we say that we here in Franconia a little bit started your interest in writing about beer?
I never thought of it that way, but I guess that's true. Yeah. I had done a couple of trips before that to explore beer in different places, like in Brussels and so on. But this was a bit more of a serious trip, since we were bicycling through the Franconian countryside and seeing things that, everyone's seen the beer bars in Brussels, but not everyone has seen the places way out in the sticks in Franconia. So I guess I felt that I was seeing something that a lot of people hadn't seen, and having gone to all this trouble to find these places, it seemed kind of silly not to leave any sort of record of what I'd found.
Yeah, and maybe you also discovered the idea of letting other people know about your interesting findings, and you did that later on. But maybe first, you now live in Oslo, and what about the beer scene in Norway? How is it at the moment, and what are the ideas, the development at the moment?
I guess the craft scene in Norway has developed very much like in most European countries, that we first had a wave of craft brewers, and we were relatively early with that. And then they have gradually gone more and more in the direction of fruited sours and the hazy IPAs and the pastry stouts. So in many ways, I feel the Norwegian beer scene is much bigger than it used to be, and also to a large extent less interesting. There are less known breweries that go in other directions, but when you go in a craft beer bar, it's typically to be a little blunt about it, the beer that has flavors that are designed to appeal to people who don't like beer fills a good proportion of the taps. Let's put it that way.
Okay, yeah, that's happening in many places in Europe at the moment. I also discovered there's a lot of cider in Norway. Is that true?
I guess you have to define a lot. So there is a fruit growing region in Western Norway called Hardanger, and they had a little wave of cider production roughly 100 years ago, 120 years ago. And then it sort of went away. But the last 30 years, the apple farmers there have come up with the idea of doing cider and managed to build it into a combination of a tourist and drinks industry. So there is such a thing as Norwegian cider, but it's not big in volume and it's not very big in impact, in bars and so on. But it definitely does exist, and it definitely does appeal to the people who travel there.
And what about the Norwegian idea of going out for a drink, being cider or beer or whatever? Is it like you live somewhere in the countryside and then you drive to a pub or to a bar, or is it more you bring the stuff home and drink it there? Or what is the normal habit in Norway if you say, let's go for a beer?
Well, in the countryside, people don't usually go to bars or anything like that. Um, some places in the countryside, like for 30, 40 years ago, had pubs, but now people mostly drink at home. They invite people or something like that. We have never really been very big on any sort of pub culture. And part of that, of course, is because everybody was brewing their own beer. So, why go out and buy something that you had for free in the cellar?
Yeah, so now we are right in the heart of my next questions, because today you are very famous for your work on Nordic farmhouse brewing. So where did you first come across that, and how did it then develop to be your main topic?
I think the first time I came across it was some friends of mine bought a bottle of the type of beer that's called Stjørdalsøl in central Norway and took it home to a tasting here in the Oslo area. And the thing with that beer was that it just didn't taste like a modern beer. It was radically different in so many different ways that it couldn't really have, it was radically different, but it also it wasn't realistic that this was the invention of a single brewer. It had to belong to a different tradition of beer, basically. And it was through my work on Lithuania that I figured out that the reason Lithuanian beer was so special was that it was farmhouse ale. And then that's when it sort of clicked for me that, but we have this in Norway. I have to see what this is.
And in Lithuania, you were just starting as a tourist, or have you been looking for beer when you went there?
I was looking for beer. So, I was looking for beer every place I went. But when I went to Lithuania, I'd read a book by a Danish brewer who was trying to come up with what he called Nordic beer. So his goal was that when you had the beer from the Nordic countries, you should be able to taste it and tell that it was Nordic. And so he went to the farmhouse brewers for inspiration, and he visited one in Lithuania where I read what he wrote about this brewer, although I didn't quite understand, really get it. But what he wrote was the guy grew his own barley and then malted it, and the hops grew on his farm, and the yeast came from a jar in the well, and the brewing process was completely weird. And I thought, this sounds like an interesting country. And I just went to Vilnius to see what I could find, and I was just blown away.
Is it true that some of it survived, especially because of the Soviet times, because they had to brew like a little bit secretly in secret places?
There does seem to be a connection, yes. So during the Soviet era, the government took over all the breweries, and there were 6 recipes that were devised in Moscow that the different breweries brewed in rotation. And in the communist system, you had a quota. You should produce so much malts or so much beer. But the nobody cared very much how good it was, right? So the breweries had difficulty getting good raw materials, and they didn't often care very much about the stuff that they produced. And meanwhile, of course, the farmers knew how to brew out in the countryside, and they kept doing it. So it even became kind of a shadow economy in the collective farms, where some people were really brewing for pay, not necessarily for money, but in goods. And some of the collective farms started using this beer as a sort of shadow currency in a sense. And so many of the breweries that still exist in the Lithuanian countryside, they actually started under communism. And then when the Soviet Union fell and you were allowed to start a business, then they started legal businesses. But strictly speaking, they were operating before that point.
That's very interesting. And to be honest, on some occasions, I also experienced that beer can be a very nice currency, especially when you are on several fairs or things where people have something you like to, and you are the one who has beer. So that's normally something that always works. But back to Lithuania, when you experienced their brewing process, what was the thing that mostly surprised you when you were watching what they do?
Well, it took. Lithuania was not an easy country to get into, unlike Norway, because most of these brewers don't actually speak English. So you need translators, and it's very hard to find people. So the first farmhouse brewer that I actually visited in Lithuania was Ramūnas Šišas, who is a commercial brewer. And what shocked me with him was that he was using the oven. He was making baked beer, keptinis alus, as it's called in Lithuania.
So he was baking the mash, or he was producing bread and mashing the bread, or how was it done?
I never found out because I was on a tour there with other people, and at that point I wasn't really. I hadn't yet understood the importance of the brewing process. The actual process of brewing can be as important as the ingredients. So we left there without me ever having fully established what it was he did. But if you make a proper keptinis alus, then there is no bread involved. What you do is you take the mash in a bread-like shape, but it's not actually a bread that you could eat, and you bake it in the oven. Yes, you caramelize the sugars.
That's really interesting. So, but before that, some saccharification had happened?
Strictly speaking, there are two types of oven-based beer. So one is where you mash beforehand, that creates all the sugars, and then you bake it. So that becomes like a caramel bomb. It's a kind of beer that people know about Schwarzbier and Porter. This is another category entirely that tastes very different. But you can also actually use the oven to heat the mash. That was how it got started, but that produces completely different flavors because you can't. It's very difficult to have as much caramelization then, unless you want to, burn out all the enzymes.
Yeah, that's the question. So, because afterwards all the enzymes will be killed.
Well, yes. So, but in the version where you mash first, you do a normal 1 hour infusion mash, and then you bake. And so there's no. You can destroy the enzymes as much as you like because they've done their job, right?
Yeah. In the first version, yes, but in the second version.
In the second version, you need to be a bit more careful. But I've seen the second version done, and basically you don't overheat the oven, and then what you put in has enough water and thermal mass that it goes through a fairly slow saccharification. So it's like a slow step mash, if you like, but without any steps, of course.
Yeah, so it goes through the temperature of saccharification, and then it also goes above, and so this is That's very interesting, yeah. And in terms of yeast, did they have something like yeast cultures, or was it like wild fermentation?
I don't know about any wild fermentation in farmhouse brewing, with the possible exception of the Swedes who were making, uh, who claimed to be making yeast out of the dew on midsummer and morning. That's kind of a weird story. I don't think those people, they must have been using something like sourdough yeast, I think. But apart from them, everyone else seems to have used domesticated yeast in one form or another. But originally, all the farmers had their own yeast that was domesticated and that was local to their area. So Ramunas Shishas still has a yeast culture that he got from his father, who got this from his grandfather. He's very secretive about this yeast, so he tells you up front, we will, we can talk about my house, we can talk about my gun, we can talk about my wife. We're not going to talk about my yeast.
Okay.
So the only person in his family who is even allowed to go close to the yeast is his oldest daughter, because his intention is that she will take over the brewing, and so she needs to know how this works.
And do you know how he stores yeast? So, like on wood or in a specific box or like this?
He wouldn't talk about it.
Okay, good. So you didn't even see some case or thing?
Nope, nothing.
No. Okay. That's awesome.
Absolutely nothing.
And then you continued your journey through Lithuania, and you also published a book about that, yeah?
Yes. This was something that didn't really happen there was never any conscious decision. I just, why am I writing this book? It was just, I gathered all this information and I just had to write it down. And I knew right away that a guide to Lithuanian beer in 2014, there's no point in even looking for a publisher. So I self-published it. But it was basically everything that I was able to learn about Lithuanian beer, so that people could discover this really very unique tradition and also find the beer. And the trouble with going to Lithuania is you go to a bar in Vilnius, you can order a lot of beers, but you don't get any information about what the beers are. And the labels are, of course, completely opaque, being written in Lithuanian, and you can't remember the names, and it's very, very hard to orient yourself in this. And I discovered much later that even people in Vilnius who were really into beer, they didn't know that these beers were farmhouse ales. So it's like one of the bartenders at one of the main bars in Vilnius told me this, and I was like, I was very surprised. But then I remembered that my friend who was my guide in Lithuania, he went on a tour of northern Lithuania in like 1996 or something, and came back to tell people in Vilnius that there are 300 little breweries in North Lithuania, and people just laughed at him. Haha, that can't be possible. But it was. It was true. So what I'm getting at is, even for Lithuanians, the stuff was hard to figure out. And so it was something I just had to publish.
Yeah, very interesting. And was it like every of these person had their own idea of the beer they made, or was there something like a common sense on some things, let's say like beer styles or ideas of beer or something like that?
I think that you can. There are definitely 3 clear farmhouse beer styles in Lithuania that you can distinguish. Of course, there is a good bit of a variation within those, but there are like 3 broad main categories. One of which I think is dead now, from Western Lithuania. But you have the Keptinis Alus, the baked beer, and there is also the straightforward Kaimiškas, which is a raw ale with pale malts. But it varies quite a lot, because some people have unusual ingredients, or they have their own yeast, or they don't have their own yeast, which adds a lot of variation. What is truly weird is that was their starting point. That and industrial lager brewing. And then because of certain legal changes and so on, some of these breweries then started brewing lager beer. But of course, they didn't brew lager beer like normal brewers. So some of them, for example, then brewed lager beer, but without having a kettle. So they brewed a raw lager. And then there was a lot of creativity. So they did bizarre things with spices and coming there in 2014, it was or even before that, it was really a shocking beer scene. It was very difficult to work out what was going on, and new beers appearing all the time, and that was really, really something unique.
Coming back to these lagers, the only thing which that had in common with normal lagers was the yeast. So everything else might have been different.
Yes, I would assume that they used infusion mashing, for example. So yes, they would be quite different.
And about the temperatures, they were having like the cold temperatures for the lager yeast, or were they fermenting also at warmer temperatures?
No, I'm pretty sure they fermented cold, but I don't know this for certain. I haven't visited all the breweries, and not all of them are willing to answer questions.
Have you returned to Lithuania since then?
Oh, I've been there almost once a year. I mean, COVID, of course. So the last time I was there was December.
Did you make them more open? Do they now give you more information, or is still there a lot of secrets?
It varies. So some people have become much more open, and some don't seem to have changed at all. There's a lot of internal politics in this. So it seems that some of them are really good friends with the guy who was my guide, and others of them seem to hate him. But it was impossible for me to know, are they like this with everybody or just him? But a lot of these people in the countryside can be very close to outsiders.
Okay. So, and then after that, you went back to Norway and tried to discover your home farmhouse brewing.
Yes. So I just figured out, okay, the Lithuanian beer was interesting because it was farmhouse ale, or at least the origin was that. And I knew that we had this in Norway, and so I teamed up with Canadian journalist Martin Thibault, who'd done an expedition in Lithuania the year before. And we we sat down to try and crack the Norwegian nut, and we spent 9 months preparing a trip of 1 week. And the trouble is, in Lithuania there's commercial breweries, and those are easy to find. In Norway, it was all home brewers, and they're not in the cities. They're way out in the countryside, and you don't even know, what are the places where they can be found. But we knew there was one place, and we tried everything. We called the Tourist Information Bureau. We wrote to local restaurants that seemed like they might have some connection. We tried. Somebody gave us a tip about this famous skier who had. She was from there, and she had some sort of business there. And we wrote to her, and we never heard anything. And the breakthrough was actually when, by chance, I got invited by family members of my own family to join a farmhouse brew. Posted about that on my blog. It got posted on Reddit, and somebody on Reddit said, "Oh, that's interesting. My best friend's father brews kind of like this, and they have their own yeast." And I'm like, "Oh, what did you say?" And I managed to tell him, "No, we want to come to him, brew with him, and see what he does. And I'll fly in some people from Canada, and we'll bring cameras and notebooks, and we really, really want to do this." And after a little back and forth, he said, "Yeah, okay. My best friend's dad said you can come. It's fine."
Wow, I'm just having this image in my head that you appeared with a dozen of guys and cameras and laptops and occupied the whole place. So, how was that experience?
We were 3 people.
Okay.
It was deeply strange. So we just show up at the local train station. They come and pick us up with a car. We drive way up the mountainside, and suddenly we're in this house, and these people that we never met come and say hello, and everybody's kind of feeling each other's teeth. But I think that they very quickly saw that we were not just genuinely interested, but passionately wanting to know exactly what they did, and also that we really respected what they were doing. We were trying to understand it on its own terms. And so if we went from being utter strangers to being almost friends by the end of the 24 hours. It was really strange. And then a week later, when the beer was finished fermenting and we'd completed our tour, we went back to Voss in order to try this beer. And I remember lugging my suitcase with Martin up this steep hill, thinking about now we're going to meet Sigmund again with a smile on my face, because by now I knew Sigmund, and I knew that he would just he would light up in a smile when he saw us, because he's just like that. And of course he did. So and basically almost all of the visits on that trip were like that. So people meet us with skepticism because their farmhouse ale has perhaps not always been treated well by outsiders, and they sort of see our attitude, and then complete turnover by the time we leave.
Is it in general legal to brew farmhouse ale in Norway?
It's like making a cake. You can do it anytime you want, and nobody cares. There's no business of the governments.
Okay, so that was not their problem, that you maybe tell the story to the wrong people or something like that. No.
But if you distill it, that's forbidden.
And what was the taste? Can you remember when you had it first time?
Yeah, that's easy. Yeah, the Sigmund's was strongly caramelly, somewhat bitter from the juniper, and then with the spicy orange character from the yeast.
And the juniper was added, or did they lauter on juniper, or how did that come into the process?
Almost all Norwegian beer is the starting point is that you take a kettle, you stuff it full of juniper, fill it with water, and then you heat it up. So you're making a kind of tea from juniper branches, and that's your brewing water. You normally also lauter through the juniper branches, but I think most of the flavor is from the infusion.
That's very interesting. I've been many times to Finland and had a lot of experience into Sahti. There, they always told me that they only lauter on the juniper, but you have a very intense juniper flavor in the beer. So, as you explain it, maybe they do the same. I don't know. Have you ever been to Finland too?
Yes. Marta and I did an expedition there in, I think, 2017. And some Finnish brewers use infusion, but it's not that common. So I would say in Norway historically, maybe something like 80% of the brewers did it. Because of which regions the brewing survives in, now probably 95% do it in Norway. In Finland, it's the other way around. It's maybe 10% that do it.
And is there any reason why they make this juniper branch tea before they start to brew with it?
Yes, because the person they learned to brew from did it.
Okay.
So everything in farmhouse brewing is like this. Nobody really knows why they are doing the things that they do. I exaggerate a little bit, because sometimes they've been able to figure it out, or they learned modern brewing textbooks and they know something. But in general, that was the way that you learned farmhouse brewing. It was just a series of steps from beginning to end that had to be repeated. So nobody ever really specified what the reason was. So there's been speculation that the juniper infusion lowers the mash pH and gives you better efficiency. There's been speculation from microbiologists that the oil in the juniper actually acts as nutrient for the yeast. Of course, it adds flavor, it adds bitterness, and if you heat the juniper for long enough, the infusion turns like deep golden or even brown. So that could be a reason to do it too, because people wanted darker beer.
Yeah, very interesting. So also my findings in Finland was that many of the traditional people used juniper mugs to drink their sahti out of it. And that also added aroma to the finished beer in the end. And they reused it very often, and it always, so it's the aroma stays, so it's really almost endless usable, and always has this juniper aroma. And I also kind of like that, so that's also interesting. It's an interesting wood I never had before.
Yeah, the drinking of juniper mugs, which they do in Estonia too, is really quite an experience. Interestingly, that's not something that people seem to have done much of in Norway, at least not in the regions where people are still brewing. So they still use wooden drinking vessels there as well, but those seem to be made from birch for the most part, and they're not. The Estonian the Estonian ones are built from staves that you put together almost like a barrel, and the Finnish ones have a cup-like size, but this cup-like shape. But the Norwegian ones are bowls for the most part.
Yeah, okay. And also in Finland, it was interesting that only very few people are left who are even able to make these juniper wood mugs. So that tradition will maybe die out very soon.
It might. It might. This is one of these skills that, at least in Norway, there are people actually working actively to preserve them. So Western Norway Cultural Academy, for example, has arranged courses in making your own beer bowl.
That's a nice idea for my next holiday. Great.
Yes.
I think the thing that mostly impacted later on the brewing world is that you found out that they were using these special organisms, or let's say yeast strains like the Kveik. When did you discover that it's definitely a different yeast in these farmhouse beers in Norway?
That was really while we were brewing with Sigmund. So the first hint was when we tasted the remains of his previous beer, because we knew the ingredients were juniper branches, Pilsner malts, and Sass hops, plus his own yeast. And then it tastes of oranges, and that's that shouldn't be possible, right?
Yes. Or no. Yes.
So that was the first hint. And then when he made the starter, and the starter started showing activity, I smelled of oranges again. And then, of course, there was the moment when he had the wort cooled and placed in the fermenter, and then he wraps the fermenter in an insulating mat. And Martin looks at him and goes, "Why are you doing that?" And he says, "Oh, so the yeast won't be too cold." And we're like, "Too cold? What temperature are you pitching at?" says Martin. And Sigmund says, "Well, 39 degrees." And we go, "What?" And while we're looking at him like gaping fish, you can see that, okay, these guys are apparently surprised by something. So he adds, "Yeah, but my brother measured temperature during fermentation to 42." Like two exploding heads, of course. And that's when we knew that, okay, well, we found something interesting here. This is not normal yeast.
So you discovered it's a different temperature, and also because it's warm, it's going way faster.
Yes, it goes faster actually at normal temperatures too. So it turns out that Kveik has a shorter lag time, which might partly be because it's keeping more sugar around after it's done fermenting. So it has energy and it's kind of ready to go when it's pitched. And also it has genetic modifications that really allow it to ferment faster even at normal temperatures.
So modifications that came because of the long-term use in the brewing process?
One must assume so. And the modification is a really simple one. The main limitation on fermentation speed for all beer yeasts is how fast you can pull maltose into the cell. And this is done with a port in the cell wall, and there's a gene called MAL that makes these ports. And Kveik has more copies of that gene, which translates into basically more ports. And the farmhouse brewers, historically and also now, ferment very, very quickly. So really, really short time period before they harvest the yeast. So there has been strong evolutionary pressure on these yeasts to ferment fast.
So they were like domesticated, something like that.
Oh, they are domesticated. There's absolutely no question about it.
And they keep it with these wooden rings, with the Kveik rings, or how do they preserve the yeast?
So the yeast rings have existed in Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, also in Hungary, and the British Isles, I think. They haven't been used only for yeast, but as far as I can tell, they have always been quite rare. So there was never the normal way to keep yeast anywhere, it seems like. And I don't know of anybody who uses them today. So that famous photo of Sigmund holding the yeast ring, that's something he did just to show us what it was like in the old days. So he himself keeps glass jars in the fridge. And if he wants to preserve something for longer, he uses a mushroom dryer to dry the yeast, turning it into yeast chips. So actually drying the yeast and keeping it as chips is the most common in Norway today.
Almost impossible to kill it.
Oh, it's easily possible. I mean, just heat it to 50 degrees and it's dead.
Of course, okay.
but so historically, the way that you preserved your yeast in Norway was nearly 100% through drying. And I think the reason was that people didn't have so much grain that they could have beer all the time, so they brewed once or twice a year, and then drying the yeast is the best way. But of course, that meant that a yeast that couldn't be dried would never survive in Norway. And I said that the yeast, the Kveik, keeps sugar around after it's done fermenting. This sugar is a special type of sugar that helps it survive drying, also helps it survive high temperatures. So it really has adapted to being dried.
And how long can it survive in the dry stage?
Depends how you keep it. So if you just keep it as dry chips, a couple of years would be no problem. If you put it in the freezer, then the most extreme example I know of was a guy who took yeast that he put in the freezer in 1996. He took it out and he vacuum packed it and sent it to me. And I unwrapped it and found this balloon that I got by mail. And I called him. It's like, what on earth have you sent me? And he didn't understand anything because the package was flat when he sent it. So this 20-year-old yeast basically found enough sugar and liquid after it thawed to start fermenting in the mail.
Wow. So it's really a very powerful yeast, yeah.
Yeah, it was in very good shape. And Richard Preece, who runs he's a microbiologist who runs a yeast company in Canada, he said that when he's measured viability of yeast chips that people have dried with, mushroom dryers or heated shoe racks, viability of that yeast is better than what the billion-dollar companies could produce. But of course, this yeast has adapted to drying.
And if we talk about yeast, do we talk about single strains or are they multiple organisms together?
Yeah, so this is they are multiple strains, and that's the same way that it was with all the commercial yeast cultures before the yeast labs purified them. So when Carlsberg invented modern yeast handling, they found multiple strains in their lager yeast, which they then isolated, and so after that they were working with single strains. But there are actually English ale breweries that have never purified their yeast, and so they still have multiple strains. And so it is with these farmhouse yeasts that, until 2014 had never seen the inside of a lab.
Yeah, I think if you mention the English, I think there's also the reason why they can brew ales and lagers with their normal yeast cultures, just changing the temperature of fermentation. So that means which strain will be the dominant.
I don't know, to be honest. The breweries that I know of that still have multiple strains, as far as I know, they only brew ale.
I didn't ask that question, but I quite often saw that they were offering lagers. And if I asked, okay, what are you using to make lagers? They say, okay, we use our normal yeast. We just ferment a little colder.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay.
and that would mean, in my eyes, that these yeasts are still like a mix of maybe bottom and top fermented yeast, and then depending on the temperature, some wins and some loses. Maybe, I'm not sure.
This is one area where people get really confused, because what I found with the farmhouse yeast is that some brewers harvest from the top and some harvest from the bottom. And you can see that these yeasts behave differently. The ones that are harvested from the top, they really want to float on top of the beer. Whereas the ones that are harvested from the bottom, once fermentation is done, they really want to drop to the bottom. But they are all ale yeast, every single one.
Really interesting. And when did you start collecting the yeast at the first moment when you have been at these Norwegian breweries, or did that start later?
No, before I went on this week-long trip in 2014, I bought a bunch of little plastic bottles. So I intended to take yeast samples if I could while we were traveling, and I'd already contacted the National Collection of Yeast Cultures in the UK, and I knew that they would receive samples if I could send them. So it started on that trip, basically.
Wow, it's a lot of research and also a little bit like espionage, whatever. Very interesting.
Well, I mean, I asked them up straight, can I have a sample? And they gave it to me. So it's when you brew beer, you always have more yeast after fermentation than you had when you started. And so there's always been a surplus of yeast. And in all of these villages, people were used to just giving each other yeast when there was a need. And later on, when there were quite few brewers, some of them sort of developed a role as yeast suppliers. So there was one guy in Voss, not Sigmund, but somebody else that I knew I was told he was supposed to have his own Kveik, and I just called him. Yeah, hello, he says, and I asked him, so I hear that you have your own Kveik, and he says, oh yeah, are you brewing? Like, instant assumption is that I want yeast because I'm gonna brew, and of course he's gonna supply. So they were they were very open-handed with that.
Interesting. And the word Kveik, is it just a normal Norwegian word, or is it a special word for that way of brewing or for the yeast?
In standard Norwegian, the word for yeast, is gjær. But there have been many different dialect words across Norway for yeast. And in Voss, the dialect word for yeast was kveik. So originally when they said kveik, it just meant yeast. But then they got into the position where there was also a type of yeast that was in the shop that you could buy, and that said gjær in big letters on the label. So eventually they started distinguishing between kveik, that's our yeast, and gjær, that's what you buy. So kveik became the name of that type of yeast in Voss. And I picked that up, but I thought that applied everywhere. So I was asking brewers all over Western Norway, like, do you have kveik, and treating it like that was an established word. And they never complained. But later on, I found that they didn't do that further north. But I just started using it like it meant this type of yeast, and that's what it seems to mean now.
Yeah, and now it's an international word. So
yeah, it is.
And as far as I understood your books, then you discovered that there is a mountain area between two parts of Norway, and there is one like yeast strain on one side and another one on the other side, and they all have their sisters and brothers and whatever, but these two are quite separate. Is that right?
Almost. We don't know if it's two or three. So in Western Norway, they have Kveik. I've collected something like 40, 45 different cultures, and each of those contains, lots and lots of strains. So Kveik is literally hundreds of individual strains of yeast. So the biggest cultural divide in Norway runs basically north-south through the middle of the southern half of the country, and It's because of the huge mountain chain that runs through there. So you can't get from eastern Norway to western Norway without driving for at least an hour through areas where there's no trees at all. You're really up in the high mountain. And that's the reason why the yeast that survived in eastern Norway is genetically different from what's in the west. So they are closely related. They are each other's closest cousins, if I can put it that way, but they're not the same. But there's two areas in eastern Norway where yeast cultures survive, and we don't know if those two areas have the same type of yeast or not.
And is it known when it started or when they started doing that? How many hundreds or thousands of years ago?
Well, it's you can find writings from say 1100 from Iceland describing people deliberately pitching yeast into beer. And we don't really know of any period of time when brewers in Europe were not deliberately pitching yeast. You can't document a year and say, in this year we know that they were spontaneously fermenting or something like that. There are texts from roughly the year 0 from Egypt that describe people deliberately pitching yeast. And there is also a very interesting archaeological find from Hallstatt in Austria, where from the salt mines, where they managed to isolate genes from ale yeast, and analyzing, they found that they were domesticated already in 600 BC. So when did this process start? We don't know, but clearly it started a very long time ago. And when did the yeast that is in Norway really branch off from other yeast? We don't know. If you look at the family tree for yeast, you can for ale yeast in general, I mean, you can see that there is a Belgian-German branch of ale yeast, and then it branches off into the UK and further to the US. Now, there was a time when we know that there was a massive migration from the Low Countries of brewers to the UK. That was the time when the UK word for beer became beer, because originally it was ale, right? This is the 15th century. So did that branching happen then? I'm not going to say that it did, but it's definitely possible. Well, Kveik branched off from these guys before that.
After you were researching all these Norwegian farmhouse brewing, what was then your next step in Sweden, for example, or again to the Baltics, or what? How did you proceed?
Well, I decided I wanted to learn as much as I could, basically, and that was through two main activities. So one was traveling to meet brewers, and the second was to do archive studies, collect archive documentation, because there is massive amounts of archive documents describing historical farmhouse brewing in different countries. So I went to Denmark and got stuff from the archives there. I went to Sweden, Estonia, and so on. I managed to get friends to grab stuff in Lithuania and so on. And I don't remember exactly the order in which I did this. So because I traveled to visit brewers in Estonia. We did Finland. I went to Russia. There was a Latvian and Lithuanian trip. More trips in Norway. A small trip to Scotland and Sweden. Yeah, still planning a trip to Gotland in Sweden in October this year.
And did you also discover, like Kveik, so specific yeast strains in these other countries?
Yeah, so the Lithuanian commercial farmhouse breweries, several of those have their own yeast, at least 3 of them. And then it turns out the farmhouse brewers in the countryside also have their own yeast. I did not collect yeast from the Lithuanian countryside, but my friend Simonas Gotautas from the Dundulis brewery, he managed to do it. And in Latvia, There's also been 2 yeast cultures found by the owner of another brewery, Labietis, Rhenish Plavins, and he managed to collect 2 cultures and sent them to me. In Finland and in Sweden, there doesn't seem to be anything anymore, neither in Denmark nor in Belarus, but I managed to find yeast cultures in Russia when I was traveling there.
And you could take them with you?
Yes, yeah. So I was there in, I think, 2018. 2018, yeah, it must be 2018. That I traveled almost from the Ural Mountains through the countryside back to Moscow. And I asked these brewers were ethnically not Russian. They were Chuvash, a Turkic-speaking people. And I asked for samples, and they were, this is no problem. And so I sent it to the National Collection of Yeast Cultures, and when I got the information, I sent it back to them in Chuvashia. And I was very lucky. I managed to get a work trip to Kazan while I was working as a software engineer in Russia. This was February 2020, so it's like a few weeks before everything shut down because of COVID. And I managed to persuade some Russian colleagues to drive me to Chuvashia, and I contacted the people I'd met there before, and they managed to find a new brewer for me. And when I came, they were super happy, and they were showing me this some sort of guide to Chuvashian culture. And there was Russian text saying that Chuvashian beer yeast was really special and had been archived with the National Collection of Yeast Cultures in the UK. And they even had the collection numbers printed in the book, and they were like, yes. So they were super happy. They saw it as recognition and validation of their culture.
And what is the closest yeast related to these strains?
That's unpublished research results. I'm not at liberty to tell you. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So we will just wait for the publication. You just mentioned Denmark. I was there just a few weeks ago, and I discovered a brewery that is still making stone beer.
I don't think "still" is the word.
Or now making, I don't know.
Yes. I think they have recreated it.
In general, they do. And also, when I did my research about beer history, also findings on one of the oldest places in Kveik-Researcher, they also used stones for heating the mash or the beer, whatever. So, did you also find that in the farmhouse brewings that they are stone brewing?
Well, I mean, we don't know if they were brewing in Kveik-Researcher, and we definitely don't know how. Although there are indications that maybe they did. Stone brewing in farmhouse brewing is still alive, and I really mean alive in the sense that it's been passed on as a continuous tradition from the past. So it's alive in Vologda Oblast in Russia, also alive in Lithuania and Latvia and parts of Finland. It was alive. It's recorded in archive documents from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark as well. Yeah, also Estonia, of course.
Yeah, and before we come back to that, just because you said it's not sure if they brewed at all at Kveik-Researcher, that is new for me because I thought it's quite sure. So but what is the reason that you say it's maybe not was the case?
That was an excellently phrased question. So the reason I say it is the evidence that they have for brewing is findings of beer stone in some containers. So beer stone is something that gets formed in a container when you brew in it, but it can get formed in other ways. So it's generally not considered 100% certain proof. There have been better methods for detecting beer residues that were developed over the last few years, has to do with using electron microscopes to look at starch granules. And I know that they did that with the vessels from Kveik-Researcher, and they didn't find the right type of starch granule. This wasn't published, but there are some PDFs that are on the web that if you really scan through a lot of pages, you can find those results.
That's really interesting, because on the other side, I found just recent some papers where they said, okay, there were like an industry of producing these stones for making the stone beer. So it doesn't make sense to have these both. Interesting. Yeah.
Well, then maybe you know something that I don't. I would really like to know about this paper if you can send me afterwards.
Of course, I will send it to you. It's also quite new. I did a talk at a beer exhibition in Southwest Germany, because they had like a jubilee in terms of beer, and there they had even a short film where a researcher team used remakes of this equipment they found in Göbekli Tepe to brew a beer with it, and it worked. I will send that to you. It's interesting. So
yeah, great.
Wow, it's a fascinating story in general. Also, we do a lot with Matthew Adams. I don't know if you know him. He's the director of the archaeology in Abydos in Egypt, and he digs out maybe the oldest, more or less, industrial brewery in the world, which was in the old Egypt times, and that's also very interesting what he tells about how they did it, and the excavation in general. So beer is a very interesting topic in terms of history, of course. Yeah. So, but let's go. Just also because that is interesting. Now, in the last years, all the Kveik story is a huge thing, and many of the home brewers are using it. But also, there is the potential that also the big brewers may be interested in using these yeast strains, because you can produce beer maybe faster, you can produce more aroma, and more other interesting things that the yeast can bring for their beers. So do you see that there is an impact of your findings on the traditional ale and lager brewing?
Not in lager brewing, I don't think, because given that it's ale yeast, it's kind of hard for that to have a direct impact in lager brewing. But Carlsberg actually got seriously interested in Kveik and did their own studies of it. This was the Carlsberg Foundation, not the brewery, but the foundation does some research for the brewery as well. But being Carlsberg, they haven't actually published it. But there is actually quite a lot of commercial beer that's been produced with Kveik. I mean, literally thousands of individual beers from commercial breweries. It's mainly been from, relatively smaller craft breweries, as far as I know. But it's something that seems to be growing, and the brewery. The challenge is that you can't brew with Kveik the same way you do with ordinary ale yeast, because it's not ordinary ale yeast. It behaves in a different way. But a number of breweries are beginning to learn how to use it, and it seems that once they learn how to use it, they start using it in at least some of their beers. It's not necessarily suitable for every beer.
How safe is it to use it in your brewery along with other ale yeasts? So is there something like an infection potential or something like that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, anytime that you are using more than one yeast strain in your brewery, there is the potential for what's called cross-infection, meaning you pitch, strain A into one beer, and strain B that you were using before comes along for the ride. I would argue that this probably happens all the time when breweries are using several different yeast strains. But for the most part, you don't notice because you pitch billions and billions in cells of strain A, and whatever drops in of strain B is very small quantities, so it doesn't end up dominating the beer. Where you get into trouble is when the cross-infection is a saison yeast, because saison yeast is diastatic. It will consume absolutely all the sugar, and there will be, bottle bombs and gushers and strange-tasting beer. But this is not a problem with Kveik, because it doesn't produce any really weird flavors. Your beer might be a little more fruity, but it's not going to be completely dry. You're not going to have bottle bombs. So, yes, there is cross-infection, not just potential. I mean, it happens, but it doesn't turn into any real problems for the most part.
Maybe in all these breweries now, there's no, let's say, pure ale yeast anymore. It's already contaminated with a little spike of Kveik.
Well, it might be while you're repitching it, but of course, Hansen's method, as it was originally called, the way that people brew now, you throw away the yeast after a few iterations and you start over, and then of course the contamination goes away. But that was the motivation for starting over.
Yeah, very fascinating stories. That's really very interesting. And something about yourself. You quit your regular jobs a few months ago and decided to be a full-time author now. So how hard was this decision?
It was somewhat hard. I mean, it wasn't something I could just do without consent from my wife, for example. And it was also, I identified with the job that I had. So it's really a change in who am I and what am I doing in this world. So it was a decision that took a good long time to mature. And the thing that sort of pushed me over the edge in the end was I sat down and I made a list of the books that I thought that I should write based on the material that I have. And when I came to the 9th title, I just, this is ridiculous. This is not going to work. I need to do something.
Yeah, and this is good news for the beer scene because now you have the time to do it.
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah, my biggest problem at the moment is finding publishers.
We are all looking forward to have more of your findings. So good luck on that, and I'm really cross my fingers for you that will work. Two last questions, maybe. What were your experiences in Prague? So did you try beers there, and did you like the beers there, or were you lucky going home again?
I definitely tried a good number of Czech beers. The reputation of Czech beer is, of course, well deserved, right? The quality of the beers was super high. What I was a little surprised to find was that apparently I'm not a huge fan of Czech lager, meaning the things that they do so well aren't apparently the things that I'm looking for in a beer. Was I happy to go home? No, I think I'd rather have a good Czech lager than the normal Norwegian industrial lager. But I'm happier in Franconia or in an English pub.
That is very nice to hear. And I also tell the many English people that there is a quite similarity between a Franconian brew pub and an English pub, because you have these large tables, people are sitting there crossover together. They have easy drinking beers, very balanced, and a very nice culture. So in both countries, and I really like that. The beer is really there, just part of the normal life, and it brings people together, which is really a very nice thing. Maybe what are your upcoming projects? So can you unveil maybe the next book title or whatever? So, or just you don't have to tell any secrets, but what can we expect from your work in the future?
Since I'm not in control of the publication schedule, I mean, I'm having difficulty finding publishers. It's really hard to say what the next book will be. So the last one that I did was a book in Norwegian on the Norwegian traditional beers, and it's really an academic book that goes into detail where you actually get the detailed information on how many people were making juniper infusion, where were they making it, how many used juniper in the filter, where did they do it, what were the brewing processes, what were the different types of yeast, how were they treating it, all. There is a map with dots for where people say they were using yeast rings or yeast logs or cloths or whatever, what have you, blah, 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 all of that stuff, culminating in an analysis of the regional differences on a higher level, and also going through more of the history more systematically than has really been done before. This book might get published in English as the next one. I also wrote a book in English that is the sort of partly kind of what I told you now, the story of me getting interested in farmhouse ale and then making these discoveries. So it's kind of telling you about these beers, but as more or less as a detective story where I'm trying to work out what exists and why things are the way that they are. But it goes much more into the historical background and what people have seen before. And so, but I'm using that as a source of stories, basically. So Viking legends and folk tales and stuff like that to really bring the story to life. But it doesn't have a publisher. I mean, the book has been finished for over a year, 2 years almost.
What a pity. I'm really curious. I'm already looking forward to both of these books. As I said, I crossed my fingers, and if some of our listeners know publishers or even are publishers, so that's the way to go. Contact Lars and help him and bring these books out, because we really want them. That's great. So thanks a lot for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'm really looking forward to meeting you again and talking about your great findings, and also have discussions about beer and beer styles and all these nice things in the beer culture.
Yeah, that discussion in Prague was great. So thank you for having me on and for all the kind words.
BierTalk, der Podcast rund ums Bier. Alle Folgen unter www.biertalk.de.